Hello class, Professor Jim Albrecht here. Today we are studying Charles Chesnutt and Anzia Yezierska, two short stories by these American fiction writers, both of them dealing with issues of assimilation and becoming American. The themes and issues I ask you to consider in this lesson are, first of all, how these two stories use a marriage plot or a romance plot to dramatize issues of assimilation and belonging, issues affecting minorities in American culture. What I really want to focus on in this mini lecture today, though, is questions of representations of racial identity and racial difference in these two stories. So what is most striking to you about the way that these two authors represent racial or ethnic identity, specifically in the character of Liza Jane in Charles Chesnutt's story, The Wife of His Youth, and Yankev Ravinsky, Rachel's father, in the story Children of Loneliness by Yezierska? So when we're talking about representation, so how are these characters described by the narrative? What do they look like? How do they act in the plot? How do they speak, especially, is an important issue. How does each author use dialect, and we'll talk about that in a second, to represent an ethnic or a racial accent? And then what is the effect of such representative techniques? How is each story encouraging readers to react emotionally or intellectually to the racial or ethnic identity or difference of these characters? So I want to provide some context for Chesnutt especially, but also for Yezierska, to remind you what W.E.B. Du Bois says in his discussion of double consciousness about the status of the dilemma really facing the African American artist. So he says in this passage, in the bottom half of this passage, the innate love of harmony and beauty that set the ruder souls of his people a dancing and a singing raised but confusion and doubt in the soul of the black artist. For the beauty revealed to him was the sole beauty of a race which his larger audience despised, and he could not articulate the message of another people. So Du Bois here seems to be describing a situation in which an African-American writer would want to write about his own people's experience, his own people's culture, and yet he knows that the larger audience, the white audience, is going to look upon that material or the styles of that culture as inferior. Du Bois says they're going to despise them. So what do you do if you are a black artist or a Jewish American artist for that matter, and you want to write about your own people, your own culture, but you're worried about the way that is going to be received by the larger audience? Well, one way is through dialect representation. And what do we mean by that? Well, dialect representation in literary terms is a very heavily accented or stylized representation that is meant to represent the way that different people in different regions of the country or from different subcultures or ethnic groups speak, what kind of accent they speak with. Well, why would writers do this? Well, one motive or purpose is because they want to be realistic, that somehow they're trying to capture the way that people actually sound when they talk. For example, Mark Twain, in the beginning, the little introduction to the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, says that the accent that he makes Huck speak in, who Huck is the first-person narrator, is very realistic to the way that a kind of a poor white boy in Missouri would talk. Okay. But another argument is that, dialect is not realistic at all. It's very artificial and stylized, and it's intended to signal difference in identity. It's a means by which to set certain characters apart, either because of their race or their ethnicity or their social class or their educational level, and that therefore can be a way to demean them or make fun of certain groups. For example, we've seen in a white writer like Harriet Beecher Stowe how even in an anti-slavery novel certain characters are portrayed with dialect representation, or Joel Chandler Harris, who I'll talk about in just a moment, and their uses of Negro dialect. A third possibility is that there are writers from ethnic groups who really wanted to celebrate the speech idioms, the style, and the culture of their own ethnic group. For example, African-American writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, two writers of the Harlem Renaissance, wrote in dialect, and they were people who were celebrating black culture and blackness and African-American culture unapologetically. Charles Chesnutt is another writer who I would say is using dialect to celebrate black culture, but it's a complicated type of a strategy that Chesnutt is using. So in particular, Chesnutt, I think, can be seen as writing in response not just to Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was immensely influential, but there was a character, a collection of tales based on African American folk tales that were collected and published by a white writer named Joel Chandler Harris. They were called the Uncle Remus tales, and Uncle Remus is the narrator, and he speaks in a heavily accented dialect speech. He's an ex-plantation slave, and he's telling these tall tales, these folk tales, like the Brer Rabbit stories and the Tar Baby. You've probably heard some of these stories. And they were immensely popular with white audiences. So Chesnutt is writing to a reading audience that he knows has an appetite for this kind of dialect speech. And this also came from minstrel shows. It's date back to the 1830s in American culture that had very racist blackface depictions, actors wearing blackface, depicting slaves, African Americans on the plantation in very racist, stereotypical fashions, and singing and comedy acts and that kind of thing. So Chesnutt published two collections of short stories right around 1899. One called The Conjure Woman and Other Stories of the Colored Line. All the stories in that collection are narrated by a character named Uncle Julius McAdoo, who also talks in a very heavily accented dialect speech. But Uncle Julius is actually undermining racist stereotypes or racist reactions that white readers might have to that character, because he's telling tales that are actually critiquing racial injustice in America. There's a real political purpose to the stories that Uncle Julius tells, and he's also telling them in a way where he's cleverly manipulating a white northern couple to whom he's telling his tales in those stories. Okay, so as you read The Wife of His Youth, I want you to think about this story within a story structure that Chesnutt is using. And right in the middle of the story, which is, a story told by a third-person narrator about Mr. Ryder, and is written in very realistic kind of prose style, we get this other story told by Liza Jane. She's a first-person narrator, and it is told in dialect representation. So I'm going to do my best to read this to you. It's very difficult to read this and try to make it sound authentic in some way, but here goes. "My name's Liza," she began, "Liza Jane. When I was young, I used to belong to Marse Bob Smith down in Old Missouri. I was born down there. When I was a gal, I was married to a man named Jim, but Jim died, and after that I married a mulatto man named Sam Taylor. Sam was freeborn, but his mammy and daddy died, and the white folks prenticed him to my master for to work him till he was growed up. Sam worked in the field, and I was the cook. One day, Marianne, old Mrs. Mate, come rushing out to the kitchen, and she says to me, 'Liza Jane, old marser gonna sell your Sam down the river.' 'Go away from here,' says I. 'My husband's free. Don't make no difference. I heerd old marser tell old miss he's gonna take your Sam away with him tomorrow, for he needed money, and he knowed where he could get $1,000 for Sam, and no questions asked. When Sam come home from the field that night, I told him about old marser going to steal him, and Sam run away. His time was most up, and he swore that when he was 21, he would come back and help me run away, or else save up the money to buy my freedom. And I know he'd have done it, for he thought a heap of me, Sam did. But when he come back, he didn't find me, for I wasn't there. Old marser had heard that I warned Sam, so he had me whipped and sold down the river." Okay, this is not her entire story, but that's a good chunk of the tale that she tells. So here are the interpretive questions I'd like you to think about as you move on in your reading and thinking about The Wife of His Youth. What about the style of Liza Jane's story? So different from the narrative of the larger frame tale, the larger story. And the content of her story. How do those two things, the style and the content of Liza Jane's story, what kind of commentary do they provide upon the attitudes or the goals of Mr. Ryder and the other members of the Blue Vein Society that the rest of the story is about? And how do you think Chesnutt's story invites readers to react to Liza Jane and her tale? What might Chesnutt be trying to get his readers to think about by presenting a story told by this character in this dialect style of speech? And lastly, how might Chesnutt, through Liza Jane's story, be commenting on the type of literature that African American writers should write? How is he commenting in some way upon his own situation as an African American author? And again, remember what Du Bois says about the dilemma that's facing black writers here. What does a story like The Wife of His Youth suggest about what the function or purpose of literature should be? Okay, now in Yezierska's stories, there's also some very interesting issues of the representation of ethnic or racial difference. So I want to look at two scenes, descriptions of Rachel's parents, her father especially. The first one is from the very beginning of the story. And what kind of a representation are we getting here of old world or European, relatively unassimilated Jewishness versus the kind of Jewish identity, Jewish American identity that Rachel is trying to achieve for herself? "Oh, mother, can't you use a fork?" exclaimed Rachel, as Mrs. Ravinsky took the shell of a baked potato in her fingers and raised it to her watering mouth. "Here, teacher in mine, you want me to learn in my old age how to put the bite in my mouth." The mother dropped the potato back into her plate, too wounded to eat. Wiping her hands on her blue-checked apron, she turned her glance to her husband, at the opposite side of the table. "Yankov," she said bitterly, "stick your bone on a fork. Our teacherin said you dasn't touch no eating with the hands." "All my teachers died already in the old country," retorted the old man. "I ain't going to learn nothing new no more from my American daughter." He continued to suck the marrow out of the bone with that noisy relish that was so exasperating to Rachel. "It's no use," stormed the girl, jumping up from the table in disgust. "I'll never be able to stand it here with you people." Okay, so right in the very opening scene of this story, we get this issue of racial or ethnic representation. How are Mr. and Mrs. Ravinsky, how do they talk here? How is their speech represented? Their manners? In contrast to the way the kind of language that the narrative uses and the kind of language that Rachel uses. Compare this as a very different moment. This is later in the story when Rachel is returning to her parents' tenement apartment, and she hears her father praying as she's approaching the apartment. Rachel had prepared herself to face the usual hailstorm of reproaches and accusations, but as she entered the dark hallway of the tenement, she heard her father's voice chanting the old familiar Hebrew psalm of the race of sorrows. "Hear my prayer, O Lord, and let my cry come unto thee. For my days are consumed like smoke, and my bones are burned as an hearth. I am like a pelican of the wilderness. I am like an owl of the desert. I have eaten ashes like bread, and mingled my drink with weeping." A faintness came over her. The sobbing strains of the lyric song melted into her veins like a magic sap, making her warm and human again. All her strength seemed to flow out of her in pity for her people. Okay, well, one thing I want you to notice here is the speech is represented very differently. This is, again, her father speaking, the same father who we heard speaking before. Now, this is a prayer, and he would be praying in Hebrew. So this is a translation of the Hebrew into English. But think of how different his voice sounds in this representation. Some interpretive questions as you think about Yezierska's story. How do you think the story is inviting us as readers to react to these very opposing portrayals of Rachel's parents? At one point in the story, Rachel's father calls her an anti-Semite, a Jew hater, right? Why might Yezierska include this accusation in her story? Is the story itself anti-Semitic, or are these representations anti-Semitic? And lastly, I don't think we can just read these scenes in relation to each other, but we have to read them as well, I think, in relation to the end of the story. So I want you to consider Rachel's exchange with Frank Baker right near the end of the story, where he speaks of the, quote, poetry which the immigrant is daily living. How does this exchange, and especially Rachel's response to Frank, how does that affect the way that you judge these issues? This question of how we do respond to Rachel's parents and their Jewish identity. So, a lot to think about in these stories. They're both really fascinating and interesting stories. One by an African American writer, one by a Jewish American writer. So, but dealing with lots of very similar kinds of issues. And I hope that you will find lots of things that you want to discuss with the rest of the class. So, happy reading.